It was a hot summer day, and the sun was beating down on the small town of Millfield. The streets were empty, as most people were inside their air-conditioned homes trying to escape the heat. But one young girl was outside, standing in front of her house with a desperate look on her face. Her name was Emily, and she was just 13 years old. She had long brown hair and big brown eyes that seemed to always be filled with worry. Today, that worry had reached a breaking point. For as long as Emily could remember, her parents had been abusive. They would yell at her for no reason, hit her when she did something they didn't like, and even lock her in her room for days at a time. Emily had tried to tell someone about the abuse, but her parents had always found a way to cover it up and convince everyone that everything was fine. Emily had had enough. She couldn't take the abuse any longer, and she knew that if she didn't do something, things were only going to get worse. So, with trembling hands, she grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and began to write a note. "Dear Mrs. Jenkins," she wrote, "I know this may seem strange, but I need your help. My parents are abusive and I'm afraid for my life. Please, save me from my parents. I'll do anything, just please help me." Emily hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should include more information or explain her situation in more detail. But she knew she had to be quick. Her parents could come home at any moment and she didn't want to be caught. She folded the note and slipped it into an envelope, then tiptoed across the lawn to her neighbor's house. Mrs. Jenkins was an elderly woman who lived alone and had always been kind to Emily. Emily hoped that she would understand the gravity of the situation and help her. She slipped the envelope through the mail slot and ran back to her house, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew that she had done everything she could to try and save herself. As the days passed, Emily waited anxiously for some kind of response from Mrs. Jenkins. She tried to act normal around her parents, but it was hard when all she could think about was the note and what might happen if her parents found out. Finally, one day, Mrs. Jenkins knocked on Emily's door. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she opened it, hoping that Mrs. Jenkins had a plan to help her. "Emily, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said, a concerned look on her face. "I received your note, and I want you to know that I'm here to help you. But we have to be careful. If your parents find out, they could hurt you even more." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe that someone was finally going to help her. Mrs. Jenkins hugged Emily and promised to do everything she could to protect her. She contacted a local domestic abuse hotline and together, they came up with a plan. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Jenkins helped Emily gather her things and made arrangements for her to stay with a family member out of town. Emily was nervous about leaving, but she knew it was the only way to escape her abusive parents. On the day of her departure, Emily hugged Mrs. Jenkins and thanked her for everything she had done. "You are a brave and strong young girl, Emily," Mrs. Jenkins said, tears in her eyes. "And I know that you will be able to overcome this difficult time in your life. Remember, you are not alone and there are people who care about you and want to help you." Emily nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long while. She got into the car with her family member and they drove off, leaving Millfield and the abuse behind. Over the next few years, Emily worked hard to heal and move on from the trauma of her past. She received therapy and support from her family member, and slowly but surely, she began to feel like herself again. She even found the courage to speak out about her experiences and became an advocate for domestic abuse victims. She shared her story at schools and community events, hoping to inspire others to seek help and break the cycle of abuse. As Emily looked back on the difficult journey she had taken, she knew that slipping that note to Mrs. Jenkins had been the turning point for her. It had taken all the courage she had to reach out for help, but it had been worth it. She was finally free from the abuse and was able to start a new chapter in her life, filled with hope and possibility.